And I think one thing would be useful to be clear about at the outset, and that is that we're talking tonight about a question of fact. If Herb is right, then I am wrong. My mistake is catastrophic because I am wasting my life in the pursuit of a delusion. On the other hand, if I am right, then Herb is wrong. It cannot possibly be true that both of us are right. Okay, but is this fact knowable? It would appear that we can either prove or disprove the existence of God. The Bible teaches that God transcends the material universe, that he's distinct from his creation. Scientific inquiry is limited to making testable hypotheses about observable phenomena. Because of its self-imposed limitations, science can't render definitive judgments about a being that exists outside its range of inquiry. You can't say science proves that God does not exist. But many people think that this is what science does say. They infer that to believe in God means that you have to close your eyes to all that science has learned. That faith is blind hope based on denial of reality. But scientists don't comprise a monolithic group, and science is not a monolithic block of information. There was a survey of American scientists taken in 1914, 90 years ago, that showed that 42% of them believed in a personal God. The same survey was re-administered in 1996, and that showed that 39% of those scientists surveyed believed in God. So, in other words, all the scientific discoveries of the past 90 years had essentially no effect on the proportion of scientists, almost half, that believe in a God. Now, I'm convinced that the existence of a creator is the most reasonable explanation of the scientifically obtained evidence regarding origins. The evidence does not prove that God exists. But I think it shows that Christianity is a reasonable belief system. In the absence of proof, one's conclusions come down to weighing the evidence. Different people weigh things differently. And intelligent people disagree on whether Christianity's message is true. But it would be hard to argue that it's not reasonable. That Christianity can't be believed by an intelligent person who's committed to free inquiry, pursuing the truth wherever the evidence leads. Before we go further, let me distinguish between two positions, which I'm going to call belief and faith. I call belief an intellectual assent to the probability of something. It's a theory that you hold in a realm of thought where proof is not possible. Faith, on the other hand, is a response we make to a person. It requires commitment. We risk nothing with belief when we simply hold a theory. We can always change it based on new information. But faith involves risk because you have something at stake. Now, the question, is there a God, falls into the realm of belief, not of faith, of belief. 90% of the human race, apparently, believes that there is a God of some kind or another. For most people, it's a reasonable inference to make from the environment that they have around. That this belief is largely unreflecting doesn't mean it should be dismissed lightly. We all have beliefs that we haven't bothered to intellectualize, that nonetheless are active. Our minds operate intuitively in many areas. I would say that most people could not explain clearly why they believe. But intuitively, they sense that the most reasonable explanation for existence is that there must have been a creator. Now, that's not the whole case for belief, obviously. Carl Sagan used to say, the universe is all there is or ever was. But no one seriously disputes today that the universe had a beginning. In fact, nearly everyone agrees that it began about 14 billion years ago with an event called the Big Bang. Now, Christians think that sounds an awful lot like God creating something out of nothing. Some people have tried to explain how this event can happen without a God, without a cause. Those that I've read seem to me to be very far-fetched. I run a manufacturing company. That's my business. I'm not on the staff at Seacoast. And I can tell you that I have never seen an undirected process, even a simple one, result in a coherent short sequence of improbabilities leads to an almost impossible result. If you have 6 independent events, each with a 10% probability of happening, what are the odds that all 6 will occur in one sequence? 1 in a million. That's 6 events. So, again, you put together a long sequence, and the odds become very long indeed. Now, what about evolution? Let me make a distinction that I think is important. There are 2 different things that people sometimes confuse when they talk about the theory of evolution. First, there's the concept that everything we know of, every living thing we know of, had antecedents, parents. And as we watch species through generations, they tend to change over time. Sometimes in ways that seem significant and persist, sometimes not. This is so undeniably true that I don't see how anyone can argue with it. But people often confuse this idea with Darwin's theory of natural selection, which insists on random, which explains that life is the product of purely random processes. I think there's a problem at the root of Darwin's theory. In The Origin of the Species, Darwin said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex order existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, then my theory would absolutely break down. Darwin assumed that simple forms of life spontaneously came into existence and then evolved into more complex forms over a long period of time. Not an unreasonable inference in 1859. But what we have learned since gaining the technology to study what goes on inside a cell is that there are no simple forms of life. The simplest life form we know, bacteria, is unimaginably complex and highly organized. The birth of the first one required the perfect assembly of many enzymes, and each enzyme requires the perfect assembly of many amino acids. And I'm not going to tell you the odds against it, lest you think I exaggerate. But Francis Crick was the co-discoverer of DNA, and no friend of religion. He said so many things have to come together for life to begin that would require, in his words, almost a miracle, which I think is kind of an ironic choice of words. But to infer the complexity came into being spontaneously requires a long leap of faith, I think. What if you buy that argument, but you still doubt? Let's hope you have doubt. Doubt is the response of intelligence to life. It's acknowledging that on this earth anyway, you do not have all the answers and you will never have all the answers. The issue isn't whether you doubt, but what you do. Some people think they shouldn't make a decision unless they have all their questions answered. The problem with that is that you will never have perfect information on any decision you ever make in life. Now, I made a distinction earlier between belief and faith. I think that the preponderance of the evidence supports the intuitive notion most people have always had that God exists. How do you move beyond belief to faith? After all, if God is transcendent, there is no way for us to discover Him unless He takes the initiative and reveals Himself to us. And that's where the Bible comes in. It's the record of God's initiative to reveal Himself to human beings. The Apostle Paul wrote that all Scripture is inspired by God. In other words, God guided the writers of the Bible to tell us about God and about how we connect with God. Does it require blind faith to believe that? The Bible's accuracy has been validated by many sources. There are certainly questions that haven't been answered. Maybe some of them will never be answered. But I think that the weight of the evidence indicates that the biblical books are just what they claim to be. Communication from God that provides the information we need to make the simple decisions in our lives. Now, the purpose of the Bible is not to provide scientific information, nor is it to provide a history of our species, or even answers to all of our philosophical questions. Its purpose, again quoting Paul, is to make us wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus, so that God's followers may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. In other words, the Bible's purpose includes practical. It says, in light of the facts of existence, here's what you should do. Here's what you should do. And the most important thing you should do, the Bible teaches, back in Christians have different theories as to how Jesus' life, death, and resurrection operate to save those who believe in it. You don't have to accept any particular theological theory as to how that works to be a Christian. But being a Christian requires that you do believe that it does work. That you trust God to extend mercy to you based on your faith in what He did. And that going forward, you entrust your life to God's guidance. To confront the truth of Christianity, you have to confront Jesus.
We'll now hear from Dr. Silver.
Thank you. I'd like to begin with what I don't believe, and then, more important, what I do believe, and then talk a little about the problems I see with the Bible-based morality. I'm an atheist. An atheist is simply someone without a belief in any gods. I can't prove that there's no God, any more than I can prove that there isn't some little green man in the Himalayas pulling strings that run the universe. I just don't have any evidence for it. That's also why I don't believe in astrology or alien abduction by UFOs. It may surprise you to know that Jack and I are not all that different with respect to our belief in gods. You see, there are over 7,000 gods that people believe in. And Jack is an atheist with respect to all gods but one. I simply don't make that one exception. I think religion arose out of fear and awe of the wonders of nature, like thunder, eclipses, earthquakes, and hurricanes. And people attributed them to acts of the gods. I understand the appeal of some religious views. Fear of death can lead to a longing for an afterlife, where we can be united forever with our loved ones in eternal bliss. But it's important to distinguish between the world as we know it and the world as we'd like it to be. Many people believe they've had personal experiences with different gods, and that can be quite comforting. But with all the conflicting religious beliefs in the world, they can't all be right. So how do people choose? As it turns out, there's a remarkable coincidence. The overwhelming majority choose the religion of their parents. Most Asians are Buddhists. People from India are mainly Hindus. Saudi Arabians are Muslims. And as you know, here in the West, the majority are Christians. Religious belief is clearly based more on geography than on theology. Now, reasonable people can disagree about whether or not there is a God, as Jack mentioned, just like they can disagree about whether the universe is going to expand forever or is eventually going to contract on itself. These are interesting scientific and philosophical questions, but to me, the most important issue is how we live our lives, regardless of our religious beliefs. I've just told you what I don't believe. Now let me tell you what I do believe. I'm not just an atheist. I'm also a secular humanist. And as a humanist, I believe we gain knowledge of the world through observation, experimentation, reading, and critical thinking. I believe that we're part of the natural world, the result of unguided evolutionary change, that ethical values are derived from human needs and interests, and they're tested by experience. I believe that morality should be based on how our actions affect others. I believe that our creeds should not be more important than our deeds, that our dogmas should never override our compassion for others. I don't give credit to a deity for my accomplishments or blame satanic forces when I behave inconsiderately. I take responsibility for my actions. But what about a Bible-based morality? Should we subscribe to the same beliefs as those writers who lived some 2,000 to 3,000 years ago in a small corner of the Mediterranean world? My answer is yes and no. Some biblical wisdom is certainly worth keeping, like love your neighbor and don't murder, steal, or lie. But these practices are necessary for survival of any science changes in light of new evidence, unlike those who subscribe to biblical inerrancy and believe nothing in the Bible is wrong. It just makes sense to discard some horrendous biblical views that were written in a period of our history when democracy was non-existent and kings ruled by divine right. Here now are some biblical passages that have caused much harm. Justification for slavery can be found throughout the Bible. For example, 1 Timothy tells us that slaves must obey their masters. And in Luke, we learn when it's permissible to beat our slaves. Nowhere in the Bible is slavery called an abomination. The biblical treatment of women is just appalling. In 1 Corinthians, we hear that women were made for the sake of man, and, in fact, that it's good for a man to not even touch a woman. However, it is better to marry than to burn. 1 Timothy says women must keep silent and not have authority over men. I think that would create quite a problem here at the College of Charleston. Here's another example from Exodus 22. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. That passage alone has been used to justify burning countless women at the stake. And you know what the penalty is in Deuteronomy for raping an unmarried woman? The rapist must pay her father 50 shekels because she's become his damaged property. And the rapist must then marry her. How would the women in the audience feel if you were told to marry your rapist? And what does the Bible say about killing civilians in war? It's not much of a problem. Ezekiel 9 says, go through the city and slay old and young, both women and little children. A slight variation of this can be found in Numbers 31. Kill all male children and women who have known man, but keep for yourselves the young girls who have not known man. As for family values, biblical passages like spare the rod, spoil the child continue to justify child abuse. In Luke 14, Jesus says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, he cannot be my disciple. There have been many centuries of anti-Semitism, as you know, and I think due in large part to biblical passages like Matthew 27. The blood of Jesus will be on all Jews and on their children. And John 48 tells us that the devil is the father of the Jews. Gay bashing continues to this day to be justified through passages like those found in Romans 1:26, which condemns homosexuality, and Leviticus, which considers it an abomination punishable by death through stoning. During the Dark Ages, when religion ruled the world, the only permissible scientific worldview was the biblical one, namely a flat earth with four corners resting on pillars at the center of the universe. Secular books were burned, along with the people who promoted them. Little scientific progress was made for 15 centuries until the Enlightenment. Even today, some believe, as the Bible says in James, that prayer should be the only allowable healing method. This would certainly cut a lot of costs at the College of Charleston in healthcare. And in Mark, believers are told that they will not be harmed by poisonous snakes. This practice really hasn't worked out so well, has it? But enough Bible quoting. I'm beginning to sound like a preacher. I really think we should pick and choose what makes sense from the Bible, just like we do with any other book. What may have seemed right 2,000 years ago may be very wrong today. So how do we make moral decisions? Even if we believe in absolutes, we're still forced to make human judgments on how to interpret them. I think we can all agree that murder is wrong. issue about euthanasia, suicide, abortion, war in Iraq, say, capital punishment, and today even stem cell research. Different religions and even people within the same religion often disagree. Where just within a 10-mile radius of the College of Charleston, there are scores of different churches, synagogues, and mosques, most claiming that they have the truth and that the others don't. So how do we decide? In tough decisions, I believe we should be guided by the consequences of our actions to individuals, to our families, and to our community, rather than by what we believe a deity might expect us to do. The question for this debate is, does it matter if we believe in a God? And my answer is, if loving and worshiping a God makes you feel good and you treat others fairly because of this belief, that's fine. Unfortunately, love of a God all too often makes people less loving of human beings who don't believe and worship as they do. You find this curious historical fact that the more intense the religion and the more profound the dogmatic belief of any period, the greater has been the cruelty. As for me, even if I were to believe in a supernatural creator, such a belief would have no impact on the kind of life I lead. What is important to me is how we treat each other regardless of our theological beliefs. Honesty and integrity need not depend on a belief in the supernatural. We don't have to believe in a certain type of God or in any God in order to be kind and compassionate to our fellow human beings.
Mr. Hill, you know,
Okay, there's a sort of left to over there. Point number one, you know, the issue of I'm an atheist about 6,999 gods, and Dr. Silverman's just slightly more consistent. Let's face it, all truth, if it is true, is exclusive. If 2 plus 2 equals 4, then it doesn't equal any other number. Okay, so to argue that because people believe in many gods, that there isn't a particular God is a fallacy in reasoning, I think. Geography versus theology? Sure, if you look at the if you look at the averages, that's true. If you look at the changes in religious beliefs through different geographic parts of the world, I think you find that Christianity is the fastest growing religion in India, in China, in any of the nations of South America, most of the third world. The idea that people believe in God because of superstition, you know, is credible if you think in terms of a pre-scientific period. But why now? Why would people be so stupid? Why would so many well-educated Americans, for example, be so stupid as to believe in a God if it was just a matter of superstition? And clearly, if the quotes that Herb gave were an accurate representation of the Bible's teaching, no mature adult should follow Jesus Christ. One of the things that Herb said near the end of his opening talk was that you know, if following God helps you to basically be a better person, then that's fine. Jesus said that basically all of the teaching of Scripture hangs on 2 things: love God and love your neighbor. And your neighbor is any human being you come in contact with, regardless of race, gender, sexual preference or orientation, or whatever else. Are there teachings in the Bible that criticize certain activities as being sin? Absolutely. And some of those, I think, are intended as communication of what God is saying is His truth. Others, and particularly many of the issues from the Old Testament, are superseded by later teaching. It's progressive revelation. stuff starts with point A, point B. By the time he gets to point B, he says, okay, now we're beyond point A, and here's what I want you to focus on. While teaching with Scripture, people often use Christians as picking and choosing what they're going to believe, and that's what a lot of the things are quoted were clearly out of context. And but let me just address a couple of things. The Bible justifies slavery. No, it doesn't. There's a lot of talk about slavery in the Bible because it existed then. And in particular, history books for adults don't tell you what to think after every fact they relate. They allow you to make those conclusions for yourself. Biblical treatment of women is, I think her things is appalling. I think that if you read history, you'll see the Christian faith did more for the status of women than any single event in history. Women before Christianity were considered to be property. And it's largely Christian teaching that has changed there. Christians used to believe that the earth was flat and was on pillars. There's a verse in Psalms that does talk about the pillars that hold the earth in place. It's a poem. Poems are figurative, but not meant to be taken literally. Finally, let me just address the point that Herb makes that atheists can be moral, ethical people. I couldn't agree more. I agree too when he said that actions are more important than words. Albert Camus was an atheist, and he compared life without belief to the Greek myth of Sisyphus, who was condemned to roll a rock up a hill in Hades forever. And as soon as he got the rock to the top of the hill, it would roll back down. His point was that life is absurd, and life, when you face the facts, it's a source of despair. And Camus didn't give in to that despair. His view was that you can still live a meaningful life, and that you can still create beauty through acts of goodness. I think that's what Herb does, and I agree. I think that that's admirable. But I have to say that I don't share his optimism. It's been said that if there is one Christian doctrine that has been empirically proven, it's the depravity of humankind. We manage to screw it up for ourselves every time we have a chance. I don't see how we're to get on to make moral progress on it. I think the second thing that is essentially futile about Herb's reasoning is that it's just another way of inventing your own meaning for life. Now, if there isn't a God, I agree that that's the best we can do. But if there is, what he's saying is that the need isn't to make bad people good. The need is to make spiritually dead people alive. And the only way that you can do that is through connecting with the source of spiritual life. The Bible teaches that that's Jesus Christ. If a moral code could have accomplished that, you would have stuck with the Torah.
Thank you. Jack said, and one point Jesus did mention that the greatest commandment is to love God and love your neighbor. Well, I do half of those. and my concern is, if loving a God makes you more loving of your neighbor, that's fine. But so many instances we've had where there are biblical comments about how loving your God makes you less loving of your neighbor, and we've had numerous holy wars because of that. And as far as the New Testament changing some things in the Old Testament, I believe you were saying something along those lines. Well, to quote from Matthew 5:17, Jesus said he wasn't here to change one But I'd like to quote from an article I read recently called "Humble Pie is Good for You." And I know you liked it too, Jack, because you wrote it. It concludes with Aesop wrote about a mighty lion captured by hunters, saved by a mouse, to which he had shown kindness. How do the mice in your life view you? Now, we both like the moral of the story, and neither of us thought that the lion and mouse literally spoke to each other. And the same with the tortoise and the hare, and other of Aesop's fables with a good message. But Jack, I wonder if you believe in talking snakes and donkeys, because the Bible tells you that they do talk. And I think that some biblical mythology, just like Greek mythology, was not necessarily meant to present factual accounts of historical events, but were attempts to make certain points. Whether or not there was a historical Achilles or Oedipus, their experiences expressed profound truths about the human condition. And I think that the Bible, at its best, does this also. But the Bible, like much of Greek mythology, is a product of its time. And we need to pick and choose what makes sense to us today. Now, I know out of the 7,000 gods that the one that you picked is God through Jesus Christ, his Son. And I do think that it is largely a part of where you were born. But I do have a problem with the kind of faith-based belief in Jesus, which seems to say that if you try to live a good life, but you happen not to believe in a resurrection, for which there is essentially no evidence outside of the Bible, then you're doomed to eternal damnation. And one can actually have that exist, but it seems like it would be not what you would call a benevolent God. It seems that if he knew in advance the creatures that he was creating, as I think you do, and also saw the future, he probably would have created humans in such a way that most of them would wind up being tortured for eternity. So I don't see how one can come out with a loving God. Because a lot of us need a certain amount of evidence, and this omniscient God would know what kind of evidence people would need to make most of us believers. And he hasn't provided that evidence. In fact, the overwhelming majority don't believe in God as personal Jesus, as a Savior. Even Christians argue among themselves what needs to be believed in order to go to have an eternity of bliss. And in terms of slavery, I agree that today most people don't believe in slavery or some of the other things that were part of the Bible. But for a long time, Christians did, and I think it wasn't so much Christianity that changed it. I think it was more feeling that this is not a correct way to treat human beings. Here in South Carolina, again, it's a matter of geography. The majority of people are Southern Baptists. Why are there Southern Baptists? There used to just be Baptists, but the Southern Baptists broke over the issue of slavery and gave numerous biblical justifications for slavery, and that's why they were formed, and that has grown here in South Carolina. So I think we need to be really careful about what our belief system is, and I think whatever you believe, whether it's in Krishna or in Jesus or in Allah or in several thousand other gods, my interest still is how you treat your fellow human beings. That is my primary concern, not with this hope for an afterlife. Because in my view, as Jack said, so many people do believe in it, no matter how different those views. I think it really is wishful thinking that we have this fear of death and we don't want to have this life end. We think that maybe life is unfair there will be a fair afterlife, but I just see no evidence at all for it.
Our next segment will be a 20 to 30-minute session of the panelists asking each other questions, and we'll start with Mr. Jack Hoey asking Dr. Silverman.
Murphy said a couple times that you don't see any evidence for the existence of a God. How do you account then for the prevalence of belief in a God today? I mean, I understand the point about 1,000 years ago, the Middle Ages. How do you account for the prevalence of belief in God today?
Well, I think, as I said, it's in large part wishful thinking. There may be even a genetic component to it. I read a book recently called The God Part of the Brain that makes people want to have something more than just you live and then you die. But people might have wanted a Santa Claus to exist too, but that doesn't make it so. Just the fact that a lot of people happen to believe, and in fact, though, there is a correlation with the more education you have, the more critical thinking skills you have, the lower the religious beliefs are. Jack, I'd be interested in how your personal behavior toward other people would change if you were to no longer believe in a God that judges your actions. I think you'd still be just as ethical and moral a person as you are now. Am I right about this?
Well, that's a hypothetical question. I have no idea. It may be that I will be. In fact, I could even say that I will hope so. But that doesn't mean, your inference from that is that, since that's the one important thing in life, is really how you treat other people. Then religion changes nothing essential. And my point is that certainly how you treat other people is important. And certainly it's what's most important to each of us in our interactions with others, is how we treat us. But ultimately, the question still comes down to this one fact. If there's a God, and his view of the matter is different, then it doesn't really matter what your or my opinion is on how well we treat others. The only question I have for you is, how do you account for the origin of life?
Well, something that I'll sometimes give an answer to is, I don't know. I think that we've learned a lot more. It may, like we had the Big Bang is probably what created the universe. We had billions of years for life to gradually develop. It didn't develop as soon as the Big Bang took place 14, 15 billion years ago, say. We had bacteria. Eventually, we had, according to Olson's book that many of the students have read, the first humans came from non-humans. Our DNA evidence seems pretty clear about that. And we really don't know for sure how life came about. But we have string theory that talks about how the universe may have come about. I'm not an evolutionary biologist, and I can't go into too many details about life, but I do know that the evolutionary biologists tend to be less likely than any other scientists to believe in a God. But even if one had a belief in a God, it would just be in some deity, some super creator of the universe. It would be hard to make that kind of jump into a belief in Christianity when there's no evidence at all for that. Okay, Jack, you mentioned the importance of believing, and I know in 1 Corinthians
Council of Nicaea was trying to determine was which of the books, and speaking of the New Testament at this point, because that's what they were concerned with, which of the books which we are confident were written by an apostle, someone who actually knew Jesus firsthand. And so that was basically how the canon was formed. A lot of people have said through the years, well, how do we know that these are the words of Jesus? A lot of people have argued that, well, this section here or these selections here seem clearly to be the words of a really good person, but some of these other things must have been put in later by people who were trying to make Jesus look like something he wasn't. The problem is that there is absolutely no evidence for any of that. It really comes down to a matter of people deciding what kind of Jesus they want to believe in and then recreating him in their own image. I'm probably one of the few people in the room old enough to have studied Latin in school, but second-year Latin students all generally used to study Caesar's commentaries or the Gallic War because Caesar was kind of like a Roman Hemingway. Short sentences, short words, so it was very easy to translate. And, I never heard anybody argue, and nor have I since, that we don't know what it is that Julius Caesar was saying in his commentaries, or we can't be confident that the text that we have has been transmitted accurately. The New Testament Gospels were written at the same time, and if you want to look at manuscript documentation in terms of old manuscripts, there are literally hundreds of times as many copies of Old Testament or New Testament manuscripts as there are of any of Caesar's works. So I don't see any reason for questioning that the transmission of the information is authentic.
Well, you talk about the accuracy of the New Testament, but if it were accurate, you would expect that a lot of the history written that wasn't part of the New Testament would confirm it. And at the time, there were stories about Jesus and miracles he had performed, but appeared nowhere else. Like there were, even in the New Testament, it talks about hundreds of graves being opened and righteous Jews coming out, seen by many. Now, you had a historian like Josephus, who wrote 20 books on a minor king, who was writing about that time. You would think he'd devote a couple pages to an incredible event like that.
It's always difficult to prove a negative. For me to speculate why Josephus didn't record some of the things that the New Testament records, obviously I can't answer that. And if you wanted to say that some of those events seem so miraculous, so amazing, that they should have been recorded by somebody, that's one thing I would say is, well, they were. Second, why weren't they confirmed by other evidence? I don't know.
Well, I'll admit I can't prove a negative either. I can't prove that Adam lived over 900 years and Noah, when he was 600 years, built an ark and took pairs of all animals, including polar bears, who must have been in the Middle East at the time. And I won't even talk about how much stuff had to be cleaned up on the ark. But I'm wondering, do you believe these biblical stories from the Old Testament? And if not, how do you decide what stories from the Old Testament to believe and what to discard?
That's a good question. One thing that, one of the things that for example, is a position at Seacoast, is that we believe that Scripture is inerrant, without error, in all things that it affirms. And, as in interpreting any piece of literature, ancient or not, of course, one of the things you have to do is make sure that you're interpreting accurately. I mean, you can read something and it seems to be saying one thing, but if you were reading in the proper context with the proper understanding, it would not be saying it. One of the key issues is always, hey, doesn't the Bible say that the world was created in 6 days? I mean, how do we reconcile that with all the scientific evidence? And, the first rule of literary criticism is decide what it is you're reading. There's a lot of poetry in the Bible. My view of the first chapter of Genesis is that it's a poem about creation. One of the reasons that I say that is that it talks about an order in which things happened on those 6 days. And of course, it's a very highly stylized literary production. And if you read it carefully, you see that the first day and the fourth day are kind of paired, and the second and fifth, and so on. But the order that it talks about, first of all, it's never referred to again in the Bible. Second, it's contradicted in Genesis chapter 2. Now, you've either got to conclude that the people who were writing that, person or persons, and the people who transmitted it were incredibly stupid or incredibly careless, which I find difficult to believe, or that wasn't the purpose of Genesis chapter 1, to explain that creation happened in 6 days. Now, the story of Adam and Eve, is that figurative? Doesn't seem to me to be. Furthermore, and what does the scientific evidence say? Nothing conclusive, but geneticist conclusion, Steve Olson wrote in his book, is that the entire human race was descended from one woman who lived within the past 150,000 years. If you're a Christian, you might say, sounds like Eve, maybe. Don't know. The flood. Was the whole earth really covered by the flood? Don't think so. I think that there was a major flood that wiped out a lot of people, and I think that, what the current speculation in terms of historians is that there was an inundation of the Black Sea. It used to be a freshwater lake, and there was a major inundation that apparently killed a lot of people. The thing about the flood, it talks about the whole world being wiped out, but one thing you've got to remember is the book of Genesis is not a history of the world. It's a history of the emergence of the Jewish people. And so the perspective of the flood, the whole world being wiped out, is from the perspective of these people who are saying we emerged from a group that all died except for us because they didn't follow God. By the same token, I think it's Matthew who talks about how it's Mark, who talks about how the entire Judean countryside came out to be baptized by John the Baptist. Now, did he meet every single person, or was he, talking in a way that maybe a little hyperbolic? I think it's too much.
Okay, I agree with you, Jack, about the creation story being a poem. I probably think that there are more poems in the Bible than you do. But I also agree that the writers of the Bible were neither stupid nor careless. You correctly point out the contradictions between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and we could mention many other contradictions. What happens is, from all accounts, there were different writers who had different oral traditions passed on, and then there was a redactor who understood, well, this says this, this says that. We want to have some kind of a unifying compromise, so we'll put both of these stories in. Unfortunately, some people tend to believe one and over the other, and then they have fights over that, and that happens in the Old and the New Testament. Is the body and blood literal when one takes communion? It depends on how you interpret it. So let's go to war, and we've had that sort of thing happen. And in terms of how we reinterpret the Bible with more insight, I agree. But I think that insight comes in different generations because the culture itself has changed. When we had slavery, Christians and others were in favor of slavery and saw justification. Treatment of women has gradually improved, and I think reinterpretations in the Bible put women in a more favorable light. I think we still have a lot of places to go. We're still a product of our time. I think at the moment you're still opposed to gay rights than you would be opposed to gay marriages. I'm guessing in 100 years there will be Christians, and there are some today, who interpret in a different way and say, as long as you love another human being, and you happen to have either a heterosexual or homosexual orientation, that's fine. And they'll find a justification in the Bible, then just as you can now find justifications for treating women fairly now.
So is that a question?
Yeah. What do you feel in terms of gay rights?
Well, in terms of gay rights, I think that...
And whether they're sinning.
What I think the Bible says about homosexuality is that sexual relations are something that God designed to take place in the context of marriage. That if sex between two homosexuals is a sin, so is sex between two unmarried heterosexual people. And I don't say that God used one as any different than the other. That sex is something that he gave to be enjoyed in the context of a committed relationship. Now you might say, well, then why aren't you in favor of gay marriage? Frankly, I don't. From the point of view of a citizen, I don't see an objection to that. In terms of as a practical measure, is that something that I don't know that it would, as its proponents claim, enhance the length of relationships. But I certainly don't think that it's a threat to traditional marriages, just because I don't think that people who are be happy with one would be happy with the other. I just view those as totally separate issues.
But then you are in favor of a committed relationship between two gay men or two lesbians? Or is that a sin?
Well, my opinion is that, now let me just say that obviously this is something that people in the church disagree on. And the way that they disagree is by weighing, your thought.
Okay. We're having so much fun talking to each other. Homosexuality is sinning.
There are a lot of issues that are not a matter of directly opposed. You can arrive at conclusions not because you're directly opposed, but because you weigh two things differently. I've read, of course, your statement of principles and values for the secular humanist organization in the Low Country. A lot of things there that we would absolutely agree on. Some things that we wouldn't aren't because we totally disagree in terms of the premises of how people ought to treat each other, but because when there are two different things that seem to be in opposition, they're not weighted differently. I think that one of the things in the church right now, obviously the traditional view has been that God created men and women differently for a specific purpose, and if you violate that purpose, then you are sinning, and sinning is falling short of what God's best is. That's what sin is. There are others who say, but the higher value here is fidelity, and if you have two people in a committed, faithful relationship, then that's more important than the sexual nature of that relationship. Now, it comes down to how you weigh different things. My sense is that that's probably going further than I would agree that the Scripture would allow you to go. That's my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that this shows two very different ways that Jack and I look at a situation. I think we may look at two gays, and I'll see here's a loving, committed relationship that helps each other. That's fine, and that's my goal, to see that humans have a happy life. And Jack says, first, what does the Bible say about it? And if this is consistent with the Bible, fine. And speaking of sins, I'll make my own confession that my wife, who's in the audience, and I had a loving, committed relationship for several years, living in sin, and then we got married, and we still have Sharon said that, I need to call you something different. We're too old for her to call me your boyfriend. But our relationship really hasn't changed. It's still a good relationship. And again, I'm looking not so much about what Scripture says, but about treating each other kindly.
One of the things that in your statement of principles says that you're steadfast in your optimism about the good, which humans can achieve. You talked about what you think good is, I think. Why do you think that it's going to prevail? Whether you're talking about prevailing against evil, or whether you're talking about prevailing against other competing notions of good, such as what's good for me.
Okay, well, first of all, you're looking at the secular humanist statement of principles and values, and I should mention that those are not commandments. It was formed by a committee, and we're all a little uncomfortable with some things, but we reached consensus. And in terms of being optimistic, I think generally we are, that this is the best direction to go, to look at how to work through negotiation and compromise to reach reasonable conclusions that will help humans. We look for things to read and some evidence from all portions, from various philosophies, from the Bible, but we treat these as just books that have some wisdom, some flaws, and we try to generally make the best decision available with the evidence that we have to live productive, healthy lives. Okay, Jack, I know you think that Jesus has unconditional love for humans and wants us all to go to heaven. But why then does he require this belief in Jesus' resurrection as primary? And if you have that belief, your good works don't seem to matter that much. You sin, you admit your sin, confess it, and still go to heaven. But somebody like Carl Sagan, as you mentioned, or Albert Schweitzer, or countless people who do not have this belief but seem to be a good person, according to this scripture, are burning in hell.
Let me say a couple things. I think there's really two issues there. One is this whole issue of Jesus claiming to be God, claiming to be the one path to you'll have eternity with God, if you want to put it that way. That is a fundamental difference with Christian religion. Muhammad, Buddha, Confucius, none of those guys ever claimed to be God. And they're all in their tombs right now. The fundamental where's the church? The basic difference in Christianity is this issue of Jesus' resurrection. Now, why is that so important? Let me put it a little different way. One of the things that I infer from reading the Bible is that freedom is important to God. And freedom means freedom to choose God or to reject it. And in that sense, I think that is God giving us ontological significance. In other words, that our being is an end in itself. We are not pawns in God's game. We have meaning and dignity and worth on our own. Now, the Bible teaches that God has a plan for his creation and that he's going to bring it about. And we get to choose whether we participate or not, whether to accept what his plan is or whether to reject it. And hell means that he gives us what we want. Now, the images of burning in hell, I think, again, that comes from the book of Revelation, which talks about the lake of fire. I think that that's figurative. The reason that I say so is that elsewhere in Revelation it talks about how dark hell is. Now, if you have a lake of fire, I would think it would be a pretty bright place. So I take that as a figurative expression, and I think it's reasonable to do that. What hell really means is that people are separated from God. And
you're saying that we were created in God's image, yet we turned out to be miserable sinners, and God made man to have and misuse this free will. Now, Jesus also presumably had free will here on earth, and he did not sin. So why didn't God make us like that with free will and not sinning? And assuming that we have this belief in Jesus' resurrection and we go to heaven, do we still have free will? And if so, aren't we going to possibly sit there and switch over if we make a mistake going from heaven to hell?
Now, that's a question I have no answer in the world. Freedom has to mean freedom to do evil as well as good. Otherwise, it's not freedom. I mean, God didn't create slaves or robots. And Steven Weinberg, who is a very brilliant physicist, outspoken atheist. That's really his issue. It has nothing to do with science. It has to do with the Holocaust. I read an article that he wrote not long ago where he said basically, he had a lot of extended family members who were killed in the Holocaust. And a God who would permit that to happen is a God that he can't believe in. And when you contemplate something that is as horrible as the Holocaust, again, it just seems like any explanation seems like an impertinence to offer. But if you think about it, where do you limit freedom and have people still be free? I can't think of a place.
Well, did Jesus have free will? And can you explain how God apparently made Jesus with free will and not sinning, and couldn't he have done it with everyone else? And why did he not want to?
Again, I think the answer that the Bible gives is that Jesus was God. He was God come to earth. That's what the virgin birth is about. So you can infer that sin is transmitted through the Y chromosome, I guess, because
something that Steven Weinberg, who I also agree is a brilliant physicist, says, and that's in seeing what has happened with religion throughout the world, and in part the Holocaust was inspired from Christian anti-Semitism. He said that with or without religion, you would have good people doing good things and evil people doing evil things. But for good people to do evil things, that takes religion. Okay.
At this time, we're going to have the opportunity to take some written questions from the audience. If you have any questions you'd like to write down and don't have any paper or pens, there's some up here at the front. Please just come down here, grab a pen or paper, or bring it down to the front, please.
I don't think God had a beginning either. because of their belief in God and because God wants me to act in a harmful way to fellow human beings, maybe someone who doesn't like abortion and hears God tell them to kill abortionists, and we've had that fairly recently with Paul Hill. That's the sort of thing I don't like. Or when we have holy wars, whether it be through Christianity, through Osama bin Laden, that's really the problem I see with not God, but with a belief in a God who wants us to do harm to our fellow human beings.
This next question is for Mr. Hoey. In the Bible, there are examples of sinners being forgiven for their sins. If people aren't held accountable for their actions by a deity, how can its existence be relevant to people's moral lives?
I'm not sure. Read that again. I'm not sure I understand what the point is.
In the Bible, there are examples of sinners being forgiven for their sins. If people aren't held accountable for their actions by a deity, how can its existence be relevant to people's moral lives?
Well, what you're really saying is that there should be justice with no mercy. And I think it's Hamlet put it that if that's the way we're to be treated, who shall escape a whipping? I don't think that, what the Bible really says is that forgiveness is the only chance that any of us have. Because if it comes down to being good, where do you draw the line? The place where God draws the line in terms of being good is perfection. And I don't care how good you are, you're not going to reach that. So what the Bible teaches is that each of us needs forgiveness if we're going to be able to live in the presence of the Holy God. At the same time, the Bible also teaches that if you believe in God, in the true God, it will be inevitably transforming. There will be a difference in your life, but there ought to be. If there isn't a difference, if you seem to be one of these people who believes in a God that is telling you to hurt people, that's pretty good evidence that you don't believe in the God of the Bible anyway.
This next question is for Dr. Silverman. Entropy and the Big Bang Theory, both are scientific theories and truths. Both are in direct contradiction to each other, which is true.
Well, I don't think they're in contradiction with each other. And scientific truths are not necessarily completely true. We have partial evidence of a lot of truths, like we knew Newton's laws were true, but to a limited extent. Einstein's theory superseded Newton's laws, and we have string theory now that might equate a couple of different scientific theories. So some things we know pretty well, they're very predictive. Some things we're not as sure about, and we'll just wait and see.
This next question is for Mr. Hoey. What was the purpose of Christ becoming a man?
How much time? There are a lot of different theological theories on that. But ultimately what the Bible teaches is that regardless of which theory you believe or which one you think holds the most weight, that the only way that God could really connect with us in the way that he wanted to is if he came down and showed us what he was really like. And if he showed us that clearly, that tangibly, the path that we needed to take to himself. So, again, what the Bible teaches is that God had to reveal himself to us. And Jesus Christ is the ultimate revelation so that we could know what God was really like.
Why did he take a couple 100,000 years to do that? And what about people who were around and died prior?
Well, one of the things I think about Jesus is that no one is going to be judged unfairly. And that if you had no opportunity to know about Jesus, then you're not going to be judged as one who did have an opportunity to know and rejected it. I don't think that anybody who lived before the time of Christ is condemned to hell because they didn't believe in someone who had been reformed.
So it's only because of Jesus that people are now going to hell?
John 3:17 says that God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved.
I'm glad we're not taking a vote here tonight.
Next question is for Dr. Silverman. What is your view on capital punishment and even punishments for crime?
I'm opposed to capital punishment. Even if somebody takes a life, I don't think it's fair to take another person's life. I think violence begets violence. But I am for justice. And I don't feel that if someone commits a crime and then just confesses their sins, then they should just be rewarded. I'm reminded of a story of a little boy who wants a bicycle very badly and prays for a bicycle. And then he learns that's not the way to do it. So he steals a bicycle and prays for forgiveness. Now that's not a good way to go.
This next question is for Mr. Hoey. If God is all-powerful and could have chosen any way he wanted for man to receive forgiveness, what does it say about God that he chose to require that innocent beings, animals, Jesus, to be sacrificed?
The innocent beings, you're referring to animals only, or
Innocent beings, in parentheses, animals / Jesus.
animals? Okay.
And his son that he tortured.
And that's a tough question. You know, why was that necessary? And you know, as I said earlier, there are a lot of different theories on that. But what it comes down to is that Christians essentially agree that somehow it was necessary. You know, it's interesting when people talk about faith. There's this sense that Christians are just these people who die in reality, close their eyes, and they hope against hope that something is true. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that usually it's inferred that that kind of denial or that kind of trust is something that underlies their belief in God. That's not the case. That's not a difficult step at all, right? And has never been for most people. It's very easy to believe that there's a God. Most people have always believed that. The difficulty with faith comes down to this issue of trusting a person. You know, before you can follow God, you have to determine that this God is worthy of being followed. If not, the position of integrity is not to follow him, regardless of what the punishment is. And you know, that is the key issue with Christianity: is can God be trusted? Can Jesus Christ be trusted? Are they worthy of being followed?
But Jack, it seems to me, at least from what I know of Christianity, the primary reason I hear about the necessity of Jesus coming back is because people believe that a talking snake convinced Adam and Eve to eat a forbidden fruit, and mankind thereafter is tainted by original sin, and Jesus came back to erase that. And that whole idea that you must pay for the sins of your ancestors, even if they were your ancestors, makes no sense to me. That I think we should be responsible for our own actions rather than actions of people who lived thousands of years ago. And I shouldn't be rewarded by people who lived thousands of years ago. I should be responsible for what I do myself.
Well, I mean, there's no concept the Bible teaches that people are going to hell because of what Adam and Eve did. Everybody is going to be judged ultimately on what they did themselves. How did sin enter the world through Adam and Eve? That's a tough one. That's a hard one to explain. I won't even try to do it.
Next question is for Dr. Silverman. You talked about your love for your wife and proper morals. How do you assess the creation of love in right or wrong without the presence of a God?
Well, I don't think God had anything to do with my love for Sharon. I think that we have a good relationship. I think there's a need for human bonding. I think that's been evolutionary. Those creatures that didn't have that interest in reproduction are now extinct. But in any case, we have these commitments that I think are good for all humans. That's why we even have a secular Humanists of the Low Country organization, because we need community just like people of various religions need community. We don't get together to worship, but we have this commonality that makes us feel good. And I don't think it has anything to do with a deity any more than chimpanzees who have bonded are bonded because of a belief in a deity.
This next question is for Mr. Hoey. Do you believe that there is only a Christian God? If so, is only the Christian religion a valid belief system?
Yeah, I don't think that there are any other gods. I think there is one God. And therefore, sorry. But as I said before, this is exclusive. And if there isn't a Christian God, then I don't know what God there might be. But there either is or isn't. I mean, it's not a matter of that can be true and other things can be true as well.
Okay, I know there's a lot more questions, but we need to get going. So the last question I'm going to ask is going to be for both, and I think this is probably the most important question that either of you can answer tonight. If your perspective turns out to be wrong and it's discovered after death, what have you lost? Mr. Hoey, you'd like to go first.
If my perspective turns out to be wrong and I don't discover it until I'm dead, is that what you're asking? Then I've lost everything. I've wasted my life. No question about that. And Herb quoted Paul's remark earlier that if the resurrection has not taken place, then Christians are more to be pitied than anybody. And that is true. So it's something that you have to be very careful to be right about. Because the opposite is also true. You stake your life on this decision you make about what its ultimate meaning is and where that meaning stems from. It's the key decision that anyone ever makes. And so it has to be made carefully. And the other thing I would say is that it has to be made because every day your life is ticking away just as mine is. And you are investing your life in something on the basis of some set of assumptions. Now, my point is, I wouldn't encourage anyone to make your decision based on anything that I've said here tonight or on anything that Herb has said. The thing that I think everybody needs to do is study this for themselves. If questions of origin are important to you, study the answers. I think that if you're seeking to find God, that you'll find satisfying answers there. But wherever your search takes you, one of the places that I would really encourage you to search is the Bible. Read the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John. Read what they say about Jesus and confront who Jesus was and claimed to be and claims to still be. And ask yourself the question, can I trust him? In the end, what I think is that if you seek God, he will be found by you. And the Bible expresses it exactly that way. And my hope is that he would be found by each one of you.
Well, if I'm wrong, I would say to God, why didn't you give us any evidence? And then I'd say, I have a lot of questions about what you wrote here. And I would hope to engage him in a dialogue that he would understand, and maybe he would be the kind of God who would feel, I know I didn't give much evidence, but I'm curious in how you lived your life, and now that you're here with me, you'll be close to me because I look for searching of us needs to find paths that enable us to live healthy and productive lives while helping our fellow human beings. My purpose is to encourage you to think critically. Some of your questions may have been answered tonight, but I hope you leave with more questions than you came with. One of the best ways to learn is through questioning, and by hearing many sides of an issue. I hope you'll continue to read and study the Bible. It is an important part of Western culture. But I hope you'll also look at biblical criticism. With this in mind, permit me to put on my professor hat and give you your homework assignment. And that's to read the following 10 books. And I have copies of this list that I'm going to read for those of you. A Demon-Haunted World by Carl Sagan. Why People Believe Weird Things, Michael Shermer. Who Wrote the Bible? Richard Friedman. Who Wrote the New Testament? Burton Mack. The History of God, Karen Armstrong. The Gnostic Gospel by Elaine Pagels. Why I Am Not a Christian, Bertrand Russell. Why Christianity Must Change or Die, Bishop John Shelby Spong. The Philosophy of Humanism by Corliss Lemann, and The Fundamentals of Extremism, of which I'm a co-author. I'd also like to thank everyone here, especially Jack, for ignoring the words of the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 6:14. The passage says, "Believers must not commune with unbelievers. What fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness, light with darkness, believers with infidels?" In case you think that nobody pays attention to such biblical passages, unfortunately they do. In fact, a few months ago, I was invited to give the invitation at a Charleston City Council meeting. Before I could even begin speaking, half of the city council members stood up and left the room. One of them justified the walkout to me later by quoting from Psalm 14. "The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. Their deeds are vile. There is not one who does good." With your indulgence, I'd like to show you an example of a humanist message and end with the same invocation that many on city council refuse to even listen to. And here it is. Thank you for this opportunity to invoke a minority point of view. Each of us is a minority in some way. It might be race, religion, sexual orientation, nationality, or any other aspect in which we may be regarded as different. Each of us is also part of some majority. It is when we wear our majority hats that we need to be most mindful of how we treat others. We must pledge our best efforts to help one another and to defend the rights of all of our citizens and residents. What divides us is not so much our religious differences in this diverse country, but the degree of commitment we have to equal freedom of conscience for all people. We are gathered today, both religious and secular members of our community, with the shared belief that we must treat our fellow human beings with respect and dignity. In this invocation, I don't ask you to close your eyes, but to keep your eyes constantly open to the serious problems that city government can solve or improve. I don't ask you to bow your heads, but to look up at what you can accomplish by applying your considerable talent and experience to the issues that confront us. As you work together on behalf of all who live in this city, may you draw strength and sustenance from one another through reason and compassion. I'd like to close in a bipartisan manner by quoting from two presidents I greatly admire, one a Republican and the other a Democrat. First, the Republican. "When I do good, I feel good. When I do bad, I feel bad. That is my religion." Abraham Lincoln. And now the Democrat. remarkable how much you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. Harry S. Truman. Thank you.
One of the things that is hard about thought is that as soon as you think you have a good paradigm, you discover that it doesn't apply in all the places that you thought it did. We have a paradigm in our legal system that basically says that the way to protect innocent people is to begin with a presumption that people are innocent until they are proven guilty. That's a good paradigm if you want to get into justice. I think that a lot of people make the mistake of trying to apply to situations that kind of thought process where it gets in the way of understanding what the truth is. Some want to make the mistake, I think, of applying that kind of approach to God. In other words, if I can't prove that God exists, then I need to defer making a decision. As I said before, the problem is that by doing that, you have decided. You've heard this referred a few times to his view that why isn't, if there is a God, why didn't he leave us any evidence? I think that that's to dismiss a little too cavalierly the belief that most people have that there is a God, that to attribute it all to wishful thinking. I think that that's a gross oversimplification. The null hypothesis, though, clearly is that there isn't a God. In other words, if you don't choose to believe, or if you say, well, I can't know, and maybe there's a cosmic force out there, then essentially you've chosen not to try to interact with God, because you said, there's no one there that I can actually meet up with. There's no one there that I can connect with. What Christianity teaches is that this isn't a religion, it's a relationship. That God is real, that he wants to know you, that he wants to connect with you. And the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the demonstration that he's given us of that Jesus is his Son, sent to save the world, sent to redeem us from ourselves. Now, the resurrection, I keep coming back to this thing that has to be viewed as a miracle, and it either happened or it didn't. I would agree that the gospel accounts can't be taken as proof of that, except insofar as they portray a psychology for the events that followed. Whatever you think did happen with that tomb, I think you have to conclude that those early disciples were convinced that the resurrection had taken place. And they were a lot closer to the event than we were. Because most of them gave their lives, and I don't mean just enduring hardship to get the message out. Most of them were tortured and killed for what they believed. You don't do that for something that you know to be a lie. You do that only if you're convinced that it's the truth. And again, they had first-hand experience. They were there. You would think that they would be able to make an accurate judgment. Otherwise, you have to conclude that they were just stupid and ignorant and maybe delusional. But I don't know of any other instance in human history where a handful of impoverished lunatics has had the impact that these men and women have had. Thank you very much.
Dr. Silverman. And I've also been asked to announce that next Friday, October 3rd, Howard will be here on